Well, hello everybody, it's Rob here at Trinity Streetsville, and here at Trinity, we're just a group of ordinary people learning to follow Jesus in our own day. Hey, I bet you're familiar with the story of the Lord of the Rings and the Ring of Power, that symbol of power and greed and desire. Is that true? Are we really controlled by greed like that? Well, stick around because today we're going to discuss the power of greed and the peace of contentment and the practice of living a simple life as an antidote to the lure of wealth. Stick around. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness, find them. That's right. If you know anything about the Lord of the Rings, and you know about this little ring of power, it's beautiful, it's small, it doesn't look like much. But for J.R. Tolkien and his whole world of the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, this ring symbolizes power, it symbolizes desire, it symbolizes greed. And actually, greed is a theme that comes up again and again in Tolkien's writings. He writes about dwarves that dig way too deep in search of treasure. He writes about dragons who sleep on gigantic piles of gold. He writes about armies that are willing to go to war just to get their hands on some of that gold. But of all the symbols and of all the things, it's the ring itself. It's the ring which is constantly whispering, "You don't have enough. I can give you more. I can give you more power. I can give you more meaning. I can give you great, great things." But the ring lies, doesn't it? The ring promises one thing but delivers another, and what it actually ends up doing is twisting and tormenting and destroying your life. And in fact, depending on who you are, you react to the ring a little differently. Of course, there was Gollum. Gollum, he didn't just own the ring owned him. It was his, what did he call it? His precious, right? It was the thing that he always thinking about. Mind was constantly focused on, and it caused his life to hollow out, and it ultimately destroyed him. Or there was another character in The Lord of the Rings. This guy's name was Boromir. And Boromir was a good man, and he thought that if he just had the ring, then he could do good in the world. He could do good things with it. But he was naive, and he was foolish. He never could have handled it. It would have destroyed him too. And in some ways, it kind of did. And then there was Aragorn. Aragorn even at one point was offered the ring, but he refused to take it because he was wise enough to know that he could not handle it. He could not wield it. It would destroy him, and he would do horrible things if he had it. And then there were hobbits. Now, hobbits are very interesting because they were like the smallest and the weakest of most of the creatures in Middle Earth, but they somehow were able, more than others, to resist the power of the ring and not be consumed by the ring. You see, because hobbits weren't, they weren't greedy, right? They didn't want gold. They didn't want power. They had very pure hearts. They had very simple lives. They had very pure motives. All the hobbits really wanted was like a good meal, some music, some friends, a good drink, some gardens that they could plant stuff in. And you know what? That turned out to be their secret power, right? Their contentment gave them this ability to resist the ring's power, at least for a while. So what we're doing is we're continuing on in our teaching series this November. This teaching series is called A Generous Life. And we're talking about things like money and greed and contentment and wealth and all those good things. And I want to just admit that for some of us here today, we might be kind of like a hobbit, kind of like Frodo. And money has never been a problem for us. It's never been a challenge. We've never felt particularly destroyed by money or felt its grip on our lives. Fair enough. There are others of us here today, maybe you're more like Boromir. You don't have a lot of money, but man, oh man, if you could get your hands on it, you could do great things with it, right? And then there's others of us here who maybe were more like Aragorn. And actually, we know that if we had money, we would do horrible things. It would change us. And so we don't want more money. Even though we don't have a lot, we don't want to get our hands on it. And then maybe there are some of us here today who are more like Gollum. And we have experienced and we have been through this time where we have allowed money to warp our hearts and to damage our lives. So which one are you? Are you wise like Aragorn when it comes to money? Are you foolish and naive like Boromir? Are you greedy like Gollum? Or are you content like Frodo? You know, Tolkien wrote that if more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. Well, today what we're going to do is we're going to take a little trip through Middle Earth, but we're really going to take a trip through the Bible. And we're going to look basically at three things. We're going to look, one, at the power of greed. Second, at the peace of contentment. And third, at the practice of simplicity. So the power of greed, the peace of contentment, and the practice of simplicity. I've given you guys notes. If you want to follow along and take some notes as we go, I would encourage you to do so. But let's start with this. Let's start with talking about the power of greed. Now, you got to be really quiet because you have to listen. Listen to what the ring is whispering. If you had just a little more, you'd finally be secure. You'd finally have enough. You see, the ring and greed and wealth whisper these things to us. On the other hand, the Bible shouts loud and clear about the dangers of greed and wealth. Ecclesiastes, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. Greed, it just never ends. It's called the myth of more. Oh, if I just had a little more, then I would. But you never can get enough. Jesus actually says, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Jesus does not say, oh, just be advised. He does not say, try to avoid greed. No, he says, watch out for it. Why does he say watch out? Because we don't see it coming. Nobody thinks they're greedy. It just grows. It's like the ring that makes you invisible. Greed itself is invisible. I have never had anyone in my 25 years of ministry come into my office and confess to me, Pastor, I'm greedy. Nobody thinks they are greedy. It's invisible. It lives in the shadows. And those who want to get rich, they fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. You know, Tolkien actually wrote about something called dragon sickness in his writings. And dragon sickness happens when somebody gets so fixated on wealth, so fixated on money, that they start isolating themselves from others. They run away to be by themselves, and they slowly wither away, and they end up dying alone. Right? That's what happens. The desire for riches tempts us, and it traps us, and it changes us until we become like Boromir or Smeagol or Thorin or Smaug or any of those characters. Now, if you were thinking this morning, okay, Rob, okay, enough of the Lord of the Rings. It's a book, Rob. It's fiction. It's a story. It's not real. Calm down, right? That's just your wedding ring on a chain. Right. But listen, the Bible says it's actually true. And not only does the Bible say this stuff is actually true, so does research. Let me show you this. This is a guy named Paul Pith. Now, that sounds like a great Hobbit name right away. Paul Pith, Mary and Pith, or something like that. But Paul Pith is a researcher. He's a psychologist at the University of California. He gave this TED Talk called, Does Money Make You Mean? And you really should watch this. It's quite fascinating because they did all these studies to see how money actually changes us. They did this one study with Monopoly where they would give one player more money, more turns, and more advantage in a game of Monopoly. And guess what happened? The rich players became loud, they became obnoxious, they became boastful, even though they didn't earn any of it. In short, they just became mean because they were rich. They did another study where they watched cars as they approached pedestrian crosswalks. And do you know that the more expensive the car, the less likely it was for the driver to stop for a pedestrian? Money makes you mean. Another study, they just simply did this. They showed adults a bowl of candy, and they said, this candy is for children. The children down the hall, please don't eat it. And the richer you were, the more likely you were to take some of that candy. And the less money you had, the less likely you were to take the candy, right? Which caused Paul Piff and his team to conclude that as a person's level of wealth increases, guess what happens? Their compassion and their empathy go down, and their sense of entitlement and self-interest go up. In other words, it's dragon sickness, right? Now, this, of course, is not always the case. It's not always the case. You can probably, there's lots of people who don't have money, poor people who are also very mean too, right? But listen, as a general rule, right, the more wealth you have, according to research, the more it will turn your heart away from people. And the more it will turn your heart away from God. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that worldly possessions tend to turn the hearts of disciples away from Jesus. Now I know, listen, nobody wants this. Nobody wants to live this way. Nobody wants to be Gollum. So how do we resist the lure of wealth, our desire for more? How do we resist the evil of greed? Well, there is another way. It's the way of the Hobbit. It's the way of contentment. You see, hobbits were not wealthy, all right, but they were content. Right? While greed drove the dwarves to do all sorts of horrible things, and while power drove the humans to do horrible things, hobbits, they just wanted a warm bed, a nice fire, right? Some food, some cheer, some songs to sing, just the ordinary joys of a shared life. And that contentment gave them this inner strength to resist the ring and to resist greed. And whether that is happening on Middle Earth or whether that's just happening here on planet Earth, it still holds true. The Bible talks about this deep peace of contentment that can save us from this restless hunger for more and more and more. Contentment, I think, is one of the most underrated virtues of all time. Greed is constantly whispering, you don't have enough yet. You don't have enough. Yet godliness with contentment is great gain. True wealth is not having a lot, but it's being happy with what you do have. To be content, you don't have to take a vow of poverty or become a monk. You just simply have to say, I have enough. I actually have more than enough. And actually, I'm happy with what I do have. Now, I don't know if you've ever had that feeling. Maybe you've been sitting down at a table, surrounded by friends, or your family, or you're in church and you're singing, or you're praying or whatever, and you just have this moment, this feeling where you say, you know what? I'm a rich man. I am rich. That is contentment. That is true wealth. And Paul goes on to say, we brought nothing into this world, and we can take absolutely nothing out of it. In other words, your net worth will not follow you into eternity. Neither will your house, neither will your savings, neither will your car, neither will your clothes. As the old saying goes, I've never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul, right? Everything you own will one day belong to someone else. Think about that. Everything you own will one day belong to someone else. You will lose every single dollar that you make. Some of it you will lose it in this life, and the rest you will lose at the end of this life. So don't build your life around something that just cannot last. But if we have food, if we have clothing, we can be content with that. The Greek word here for clothing literally means just coverings, right? The basics, food, clothing, shelter, enough, right? This is how you live a lighter life, not chained down by the need for more, not chained down to your bank balance. Contentment actually redefines what a successful life is, right? I don't actually need one more purchase to be successful. I don't need one more vacation. I don't need one more upgrade, right, to be secure. If I have God, and if I have the basics, then I'm a success, right? I have enough. Randy Alcorn has this great quote. He says, contentment is being satisfied in whose you are who you are, and then what you have. Or Chrysostom said it's for not to possess much, but to need little is to be rich indeed. I mean, don't we often say, if I just had this one more thing or this one other achievement, then I would be content. It's a lie. When you get that one more thing or achieve that one more thing, you will feel exactly the way you feel right now. But here's the good news. You can learn contentment. I mean, last week we talked about how generosity is a practice that teaches us, and we can learn to be generous, and that teaches us to lead a joyful life. Well, this week, I want to teach you another practice. It's a practice that we can employ whenever we hear the whispers of greed. And it's a practice, actually, that hobbits clearly have learned. Many people on earth, many saints have learned this practice, and Jesus, of course, demonstrates it more than anyone else, and that is the practice of simplicity. If contentment is this peace that you feel, then simplicity is the practice that you live. Say that again. If contentment is the peace you feel, then simplicity is the practice that you live. Well, you say, well, what is simplicity? Well, again, think about hobbits for a moment. They had simple lives. They weren't poor. Were hobbits poor? No, they weren't poor. They weren't sad either. No. They had great lives, but they had just made a choice. At some point in their culture, they had made a choice to live with enough so that they could focus on other things that actually mattered way, way more. Justin Whitmell Early puts it this way. He says, simplicity is a way of saying yes to what matters by saying no to what does not. The reason I think we love hobbits is because they learned to say no to the things that don't matter, so they could actually say yes to the things that do matter. I want to close by just sharing with you 4 lessons from the Shire about how to live a simple life. First is this. Simplicity just simply means this: living with less stuff. Hobbits, if you read the books, they don't crave more stuff or bigger stuff or better stuff. You look at their houses, right? Have you ever seen a hobbit hole, right? It's very simple. It's very practical. It's very comfortable, but it's not luxurious or lavish in any way, right? They don't need much to be happy, hobbits. In fact, one of the things that Tolkien says about hobbits is they have this extreme dislike for complicated machines. They don't like complicated things. Hobbits would never have a cell phone. A smartphone's way too complicated. It's way too expensive. Instead, Tolkien says that hobbits are fond of peace and quiet and good tilled earth. There are 2 ways to get enough, Chesterton says. One is to accumulate more. The other is to desire less. There's 2 ways to get rich. One is to make more. The other is to want less. Hobbits chose the second way. You can be rich when you delight in what you already have, and then you live with less. That's the first lesson. The second lesson the hobbits teach us about simplicity is that simplicity means giving away more. Right? Giving away your possessions, giving away your wealth, giving away your time. In fact, in Hobbit culture, do you know what you did on your birthday? Does anyone remember what? Right? Yes, you don't get presents on your birthday if you're a Hobbit. You actually give presents away to people, which means a birthday is a very expensive thing to celebrate if you live in the Shire. You got to give stuff away. Even the ring itself, though it was very costly and very valuable, was given as a gift from Bilbo to Frodo. Hobbits seem to have no trouble parting with their possessions. In fact, Tolkien invented a new word, this word called a matham, M-A-T-H-O-M. A matham was anything that you had, anything that you didn't need, that you could just give away to someone. So it might be an extra pipe, an extra hat, it might be that you had a teapot you didn't use anymore, right? And these items were just given away, and they would travel from house to house and from hand to hand, and sometimes they would even return back to the original owner, right? They just had no trouble giving stuff away. St. Basil wrote this. He said, "The bread in your cupboard belongs to the hungry. The coat hanging hanging unused in your closet belongs to the one who needs it. The money that you hoard belongs to the poor. The more we give away, the more room we have for freedom and peace and contentment within us. But thirdly, simplicity also means putting others first. Putting community first. You see, greed always isolates you from community, right? Smaug the dragon, he slept alone on his pile of gold. Gollum lived alone all by himself. The dwarves, they were always divided, fighting over treasure. But simplicity allows you to be with friends and to be with family and to put them above all the stuff. Look at the hobbits. They eat together. They celebrate together. They look after each other. In many ways, they belong to each other. It's the same way that the early church lived, right? All the believers were together and they had everything in common, selling their possessions and good they shared with anyone who was in need. The first volume of The Lord of the Rings was called The Fellowship of the Ring. Fellowship. I'm not naive. I mean, community can be a place where people get really competitive and they compare themselves to each other, but community can also be the place where we treasure each other. Okay? And finally, simplicity also means being available for God. Okay, so Bilbo and Frodo were both able to leave their homes and go on this great mission at the drop of a hat. And they weren't held back by their possessions. They weren't held back by their commitments. They held those things so loosely that they left it all to pursue this greater purpose. Christians have a greater purpose. We have a greater mission to seek the kingdom of God. But many people can't go on that mission. Why? Oh, because I bought a field. I need to go see it. Please excuse me. Oh, I bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm going to go try them out. Please excuse me, Jesus. I can't go on that mission. I can't go with you today. These excuses are all based on the fact that they had material attachments. But simplicity of life allows us to focus on the mission before us and to be available to God to say, yes, Lord, send me, Lord, use me, Lord. Living with less, giving away more, putting others first and being available to God. Guys, what would it look like for us to live like hobbits here in Streetsville? What would it look like for you to live with less? Well, it would probably mean a lifestyle change of some sort. It would mean that maybe you drive a used car instead of a new one. It means maybe you hang on to your clothes a little longer before you replace them. It means you probably brew your own coffee at home rather than constantly buying it at Starbucks each and every day. The point is that the world should be able to look at us and say, oh, there's something different about them. Right? They don't seem to be caught up in that same rat race we are. They're choosing a simpler way of life. What would it look like for us to live like hobbits and give away more? What kind of mathams do you have in your house? What could you give away? Sell it and then give the money away to someone, right? Just start, maybe even this week, with 1 or 2 things that you just do not need anymore and give them to someone who does. Many of us, it's really hard for us to imagine giving things away because we already spend just about everything we make right up to the limit, right? But as we simplify our lives and as we create space, we create this margin in our budgets and this margin in our schedules that then allows us to be able to give away to others. What would it look like for our church to live like hobbits and to kind of be this community that put others first? The early church was incredibly economically diverse, and so is our church, by the way. Some of us here are living paycheck to paycheck. Others of us are doing really, really well. And there's others of us who are kind of somewhere in the middle. And I don't say that to shame anyone or to guilt anyone, but just to say that we cannot let wealth get in the way of community. And we can't allow money to somehow determine how we value each other here at Trinity Streetsville. Imagine a church that instead of measuring ourselves against each other and hanging out with people who are kind of in our same socioeconomic bracket, that we actually honored one another by living simply and giving generously and openly. And just imagine what the world would think if they saw this community that we formed where nobody was left to carry the fear of financial burdens alone. If we live that way, simplicity it wouldn't just be possible, it would actually be beautiful and so attractive. And finally, what would it look like for us to live like hobbits? By making ourselves available to God, to say yes when God calls. Is there something in your life that right now that God has been saying, I want you to go do this, I want you to go give this, but you're saying, I just can't do that. But if you were to simplify your life, you could say yes. If you were to simplify your life, you could serve. If you were to simplify your life, you could give, right? If I could simplify, I could be more generous. And you could say yes and yes and yes to God. Simplicity gives us back the ability to say yes to God. So listen, the ring of greed, it whispers to us, it bends us, it isolates us, destroys us. But the good news is, your story is not Gollum's story, right? There's another way to live. It's the way of Frodo, the way of Sam. It's the way of the Shire. It's the way of simplicity. It's the way of contentment. But really, it's the way of Jesus, right? The ring whispers, I'll give you more. Greed whispers, you need more. But Jesus whispers, my grace is sufficient for you. In me, you already have everything you need. Thanks be to God. Amen.